The iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max are dead. Or rather discontinued, but that doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91Tech, and with Apple's new iPhone lineup, both the iPhone 13 as well as the iPhone 15 Pro have been discontinued. And given I did do a video on the 13 already, I thought it was only appropriate to do one for the far newer phone that I myself own and am currently still using. I do plan on doing a full 1 year later sort of review soon, but I figured this would be a good opportunity to talk about what the 15 Pro brought to the table, how it holds up, and where it will stand in the future. And for what it's worth, while Apple is no longer selling the 15 Pro, it likely will still be sold by various carriers and retailers, potentially even on clearance as their remaining inventory dwindles. If you can find a good deal, I think it's absolutely worth a buy, especially since the phone is so similar to the 16 Pro. The used market can also be worth a look, so we'll talk about that again in a bit. Of course, the 15 Pro only came out a year ago, September 2023, but Apple has done this every year since 2018, replacing the previous Pro iPhone with their new Pro outright. It started with the iPhone XS replacing the iPhone X, then the 11 Pro replacing the XS, and so on and so forth. They began doing this for a couple different reasons. The first and more positive perspective is because of their upper mid-range flagships they're doing yearly. Phones like the iPhone 16, 15, 14, all the way down to the XR. Releasing two phones every year means their lineup would be far too crowded if they kept their main flagships around, so instead they just lower the price of the non-Pro variant and get rid of their headlining flagship in favor of the new one. In this case, the iPhone 15 Pro is gone for the sake of the 16 Pro. They don't need to keep the 15 Pro around because there's still plenty of choice at price points lower than the 16 Pro, whereas back in the day when they say release the iPhone 5, they needed some more budget-oriented devices, so they kept around the iPhone 4S and the iPhone 4. That's the true, practical, but also positive view of why Apple drops their previous Pro iPhone every year. Their lineup is already crowded enough, and they don't need it competing with their other phones. The more negative, but also realistic perspective is that, quite frankly, their Pro releases are generally far too similar to each other for Apple to be able to keep their previous model around without cannibalizing sales from their top option. If the 15 Pro remains just at a slightly lower price, it would absolutely steal a ton of sales away from not only the 16 Pro, but the non-Pro 16 as well, especially since it is a significantly better phone than the $800 16 in a lot of different ways. Since the iPhone X, the iPhone lineup has been plagued by incredibly small incremental changes in most models year to year, with only a few notable exceptions. The iPhone XS from the iPhone X is one of the smallest iPhone upgrades ever, and so it did make complete sense at the time to drop the iPhone X outright. And the iPhone XR also helped fill out the iPhone lineup, so everything sort of just worked out. The iPhone 11 Pro was a far more substantial upgrade, but even then, the XS would have stolen sales had it stuck around, so once again, it was dropped, and suddenly Apple had established their release pattern for the foreseeable future. A Pro iPhone, a non-Pro iPhone of the same number, then keep around solely the other non-Pro iPhones and drop their prices by $100 or so. One thing I find interesting is that once upon a time, Apple had a lot more options for price points, and it wasn't that long ago. I'm talking about 2021, around the iPhone 13 launch, Apple actually had the iPhone 11 available at $500. I point this out because this was, to my recollection, the last time we've seen a $500 iPhone, which I think was a pretty solid deal at the time, and at the moment, their lowest tier currently is the iPhone 14 at $600. Okay, not quite true, the iPhone SE does exist. At $430 though, it's so absurdly overpriced, I would almost rather pretend it doesn't exist at all if I'm being honest. But perhaps I'm getting off topic. The iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max are the subject today. Phones only sold for a year, but still fantastic flagships without a doubt, that have held up incredibly well, as you would expect for a phone that could cost $1,000 plus as recently as early September. As said, you may be able to find the phone on clearance for a little while longer until inventory dries up, and I do think this is an amazing smartphone in 2024, 2025, and even beyond. It is so dang similar to the iPhone 16 Pro that I myself, a tech reviewer who has been buying the newest iPhone model for the past 7 years, is skipping this year, at least for the time being. And I did already do a video on my reasoning why, but something I maybe didn't talk enough about in that video is how much I really do love my iPhone 15 Pro Max. It's a really stellar smartphone, and it ticks all the boxes for what I want from a device day to day. The design is gorgeous, and that is something I care about. The photography is excellent, the display is vibrant and sharp, the 120Hz ProMotion makes the experience feel fluid and buttery smooth, the dynamic island is as dynamic as ever, and perhaps most importantly, the battery life has never, ever let me down, with only the occasional, somewhat close call. I've had to drive multiple hours when already starting at a battery percentage lower than 30, but Google Maps still wasn't enough to make me need to charge the phone before going to bed at night. And while being the max size helps, the phone really just does have great battery life. For the record, here's my battery health. I've got over 200 cycles on it, not sure what the normal numbers are for a year of usage, but in any case, my maximum capacity is still apparently 100%. Alright, so let's go ahead and refocus here on the biggest things the 15 Pro brought to the table. And I think the main features were threefold, assuming I'm not missing anything important. Titanium, USB-C, and the action button. Those are some of the biggest anyways, along with the typical photography and power improvements. Titanium, who cares? This was sort of a nothing change. It doesn't mean much. Stainless steel was totally fine, but I think for the sake of marketing, they decided to go with some sort of new material to shake things up, and I'm not necessarily against it, although it is worth emphasizing that the 15 Pro, when it came to immediate durability tests, seemed far worse than the 14 Pro. Now, I haven't cracked my 15 Pro, and I've dropped it a good few times, and you know, Apple always says these are their most durable phones ever. I don't think it's fragile per se, but it is worth noting that I don't think anything was wrong with the stainless steel either. There was also some early teething issues with the 15 Pro launch, including overheating. I myself experienced that. I am happy to say Apple fixed that in updates, and I don't really have an overheating issue at all anymore. The phone does still get warm sometimes, but it's fairly uncommon and typically only when you're doing something more intensive. And then there's USB-C, which for a lot of people was probably the biggest thing this phone brought. And I would mostly include myself in that. Being a tech reviewer, I have a lot of tech and most of it is charged with USB-C. So having my phone also charged with USB-C and connect to my computer that way, yeah, it's actually pretty nice and very useful. If the iPhone 15 Pro hadn't had USB-C, but the 16 Pro did, I'd be far more inclined to buy the 16 Pro this year. It is still crazy to me that the box came with the USB 2 USB-C charger. I don't care that it's braided. They should have given us a USB 3 charger. That's stupid, honestly. It is. It's just so cheap on their part. Very typical Apple, and they're doing the exact same thing this year with the 16 Pro. Shocker. But I digress. USB-C, great feature. Glad we have it, even if I could be negative and point out how the EU forced Apple to do it in the first place. But still, hey, it's a win overall. The action button for me is honestly a completely meaningless feature. I'm sure some people do get a lot of use out of it, but I solely use it for the ringer switch still, and that does sort of make it redundant. I just haven't found myself feeling like switching it to anything different, even though it's not hard to bring down the control center and turn off or turn on the ringer from there if I wanted to. I'm just stuck in my ways, I guess. The design and build here is very gorgeous and nearly identical to the 16 Pro. Honestly, I could go around telling people that what I have is in fact the 16 Pro, and I highly doubt anyone would know the difference unless they had one for themselves. The bezels slimming further and the size increases feels like meaningless changes, and while the new Desert Titanium is nice and all, I do still find it disappointing the color selection this year doesn't even have a blue option. I got the natural titanium last year, and this year I would have went for the blue had I been upgrading to begin with, which ultimately I decided not to do, of course. Again, this is not a review of the 15 Pro, but I mainly want to emphasize the different features and reasonings as to why I'm so content to keep this phone over the 16 Pro and what makes it so great. One of the biggest, and for me at least, absolute best reasons I don't feel the need to upgrade is actually Apple Intelligence, which will only be fully utilized on Apple's most powerful phones. The iPhone 16 and 16 Pro, of course, and then also the iPhone 15 Pro. This is actually something I ended up dropping from that huge 2-hour video I did on the peak of iPhone and how things are maybe going downhill these days, but how insane is it that when Apple announced Apple Intelligence at WWDC back in June, they said it would only be compatible with the 15 Pro. At the same time, they would continue to sell the iPhone 15 and 15 Plus just as expensive as ever, marketed as true flagship contenders despite missing out on one of the biggest features of iOS 18. I do think it's a bit of a pity the iPhone 15 can't do the Apple Intelligence stuff, but Apple did it to themselves by giving that phone the A16 chipset rather than the A17. Actually, the 15 Pro has the A17 Pro chip, despite the fact that there is no non-Pro A17 chip. I'm not kidding, they named their chip the A17 Pro purely, I guess, for the sake of marketing, even though there is no A17, unless a non-Pro version of the chip comes along someday in a different product. But I'm getting off track. Basically, because the iPhone 15 Pro can run the Apple Intelligence stuff, I'm able to mess around with all of it despite not buying Apple's newest phone this year. While I can't see myself using it a whole lot, and I've already stated that I'm not particularly excited for it, AI right now I think is just a huge fad that Apple's jumping aboard as quickly as possible. This doesn't mean it won't be a solid, even really useful feature set that may be more impactful than I expect. Either way, I'll be able to try it out on my iPhone 15 Pro, and I'm happy for that. I also don't really feel like I'm missing out at photography as much as I probably would use that camera control button. One thing I already already have is the 5x zoom telephoto lens. This was only available on the 15 Pro Max, and it's actually really grown on me over the past year. The 3x zoom lens stayed on the non-Max 15 Pro, but this year the 5x is on both sizes of the 16 Pro. One thing I actually appreciated on my 15 Pro Max, especially when I first got it, is how the phone is surprisingly light and thin compared to even my old 14 Pro. This was a rare change, given how iPhones had only been getting chunkier mainly for bigger batteries. I prefer a larger phone with a good battery, but if a device can pull off a slimmer form factor and not compromise on the power performance, then I'm all for it. Supposedly, next year with the iPhone 17 line, we'll be seeing a new, very slim model, and it'll be the biggest upgrade in a while. Whether that's true or not remains to be seen, but hopefully it does end up being the case, if only for the fact that iPhones have felt so stale for so long. With the exception of USB-C and the dynamic island, the Pro iPhones feel practically unchanged since even the 13 Pro, and even that phone looked nearly identical to the 12 Pro. It just brought ProMotion, which I really loved, as well as a reduced notch size. And the 12 Pro, despite the flat edges, doesn't look too far from the 11 Pro either. In fact, if you look at iPhones since the 11 Pro, there's really no question that Apple's evolution in these devices has been very minor over the past half decade. It's easy to chastise Apple for refusing to innovate, and instead playing it safe every year. But in fairness, a lot of the smartphone market is in a similar boat, and frankly, there's nothing inherently wrong with this design. In fact, I've even mocked Apple before for the whole titanium thing, feeling like change purely for the sake of change. And so if they do end up making something very different next year, I'm all for it, assuming the product is actually better. But for now, these designs are in fact great, and I do think there is some positivity to be taken from the lack of change in yearly smartphone upgrades. It means that, frankly, you can go longer without upgrading your phone. Only a decade ago, people would often own smartphones on a 2-year cycle. With changes coming so quickly, you would feel left behind if you didn't upgrade on a somewhat frequent basis. Plus, phones would get slower and lose updates far faster than they do now. Heck, with iOS 18, the iPhone XS and XR are fully up to date and, in my own experience, offer pretty decent performance. Even with the iOS 18 beta I was using on those phones earlier this year for some reviews. If people are now able to keep their phones longer, it helps offset some of the pain that comes with the high price tags that we see these days. A $1,000 phone that lasts you 3 to 5 years isn't necessarily poor value in my eyes, even compared to, say, a $600 phone that only lasts you 2 years. While I'm certainly not content with Apple acting complacent, as it feels they have, hence that 2-hour very much brief retrospective I did, link in the description, I do believe it's important not to be too gloomy or negative when smartphones as a whole are as amazing as they've ever been. They're so amazing, in fact, that a phone I bought a year ago still feels fresh and new enough that I'm fully happy to keep using it, despite the fact there is now a new shiny iPhone available that would be a tax write-off for me. I don't want to spend $2,000 on a new phone right now, and yes, it really is that much Canadian with tax for the Pro Max at least. Whereas in past years, I often did want to spend that because there was at least some feature I didn't want to miss out on, either for myself or for reviews on this channel. But the 15 Pro Max is such a solid, consistent smartphone, I don't feel that desire this year. And whether that's a detriment to Apple's newest iPhones or a compliment to the 15 Pro, ultimately I am happy to live in a world where smartphones are as capable and almost fantastical as they are. This technology is beyond the imaginations of science fiction even only 2 decades ago. And while sure, not a whole lot has changed since the 2017 iPhone X, maybe that's at least in part because what we now have is already so good. There's plenty to complain about with modern Apple and the smartphone industry at large, but there's also a lot of good that often gets disregarded, including by myself. So with that in mind, before we wrap things up, let's discuss in brief the iPhone 15 Pro's standing for 2025. This is a really great smartphone and one that might be worth picking up either on clearance or from the second-hand market. It runs Apple Intelligence, which is probably the biggest feature of the iPhone 16 line, and it feels every bit as premium as the iPhone 16 Pro. I've also said as well that I think the 14 Pro is a pretty solid option right now, which is currently on Apple's refurbished section, at least in the US. The 15 Pro may pop up on there eventually as well, and if it does, it very well might be worth a look. As for buying used, I would recommend a local option like Facebook Marketplace for the best potential deals and maybe some negotiation, but something like eBay.com works well too, and on there I found the 15 Pro often around $800 and as low as maybe $700, which is still quite a lot of money, but the price will likely slowly reduce over time, Again, still got a full review in the works here, but I do think for the right price, the 15 Pro is a great buy. Though to be sure, there's absolutely nothing wrong with purchasing the 16 or the 16 Pro either if you think one of those phones is right for you. Honestly, just buy what you want. That's always my ultimate recommendation. Whatever makes you happy, so long as it fits your budget and lifestyle, go for it. Apple does really make some great smartphones, even if the amount of change year to year has dramatically slowed down. The iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max have been discontinued and are already forgotten by Apple, but that doesn't mean in any way they're poor devices, and they'll still continue to serve their millions upon millions of users just as well as they ever did. There are two sides to every coin, and while the 15 Pro was criticized when it came out for being too similar to the 14 Pro, the upside is that it's also too similar to the 16 Pro, and thus still feels like the Apple flagship it's always been. I'm gonna keep using my 15 Pro Max for at least a little while longer, and if you yourself have the phone too, or are thinking about getting it, please make sure you leave a comment down below with your thoughts. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I've been doing these death of iPhone videos inconsistently for a number of years now, but I don't think I've done one for Apple's main flagship since the iPhone 11 Pro. And maybe it's because the new Pro iPhones have felt so similar to the previous generation, it hasn't really felt like the predecessor was really gone, or maybe I've just been lazy. In any case, the iPhone 15 Pro is dead, but only in Apple's lineup, and that's fine by me. Apologies for my voice, by the way. I realize it's fairly strained. I think I've been doing too much recording lately. Huge shout out to the channel members for being absolutely amazing people, and thank you all so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.